Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar, Jackson's Prose, the Closing Statement with Bryan A. Garner. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, for international humanitarian law, and for the Jackson Center itself. And during the course of this year, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, which occurred just about 2 weeks ago on July 11th. The 20th anniversary of the Robert H. Jackson Center itself, and most relevant to our webinar today, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and the birth of international humanitarian law. And today, in fact, is the actual 75th anniversary of the date U.S. Chief of Counsel Robert H. Jackson delivered his closing address at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Much like his opening statement, he knew his audience was broader than just those physically present in courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice. And so his goal was broader than just a summation of the 8 months of trial testimony and evidence. And I am delighted to welcome Bryan Garner as our guest today to talk about Jackson's closing arguments, the language he used, and his delivery. So Bryan Garner is the award-winning author of more than 25 books. He writes on jurisprudence, lexicography, grammar, advocacy, and legal drafting. His magnum opus is the 4th edition of Garner's Modern English Usage, published by Oxford University Press, a 1,000-page book that uses big data in the assessment of English words and phrases. And in the legal world, he is best known as the editor-in-chief of the past 5 editions of Black's Law Dictionary, the most widely cited law book in the world, and a gift I received when I graduated from college going into law school. He is the most frequently cited scholar in U.S. Supreme Court opinions, and during the past 3 terms, the Supreme Court cited his work in more than 20% of its decisions. At SMU Dedman School of Law, where he has taught since 1990, he holds the title Distinguished Research Professor of Law, and he also teaches at the University of Texas School of Law. And Bryan, I understand you have been listening to Jackson's closing statement on consistent repeat in order to prepare for today's talk. And that is quite a commitment, since although it's shorter than his opening statement, it's still a couple hours long in and of itself. And in fact, the written version is about that thick. As you can see here, we have in our archives, I pulled this out special today to showcase here. But I also understand from our chats preparing for this that you have a family connection to the prosecutorial work done at the end of World War II. And your, I think I have this right, grandfather, Meade Griffin, served as the chief of the prosecution subsection of the U.S. Army's War Crimes Branch, which was based out of Wiesbaden, I believe, and handled some of the smaller and individual trials after the war. And then he, of course, went on to serve as the Associate Justice of the Texas Supreme Court for about 20 years, from 1949 to 1968. So, Bryan, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Kristen. 75 years ago today, Justice Robert H. Jackson delivered the greatest, most eloquent closing argument in the modern era. He knew that it was a great speech, just as he knew that his opening statement had been a great speech. Somehow, something in his background gave him a flair for eloquence. This man had no college and only 1 year of law school. That may well have been to his advantage. In my experience, intellectually inclined people who feel educationally impoverished and spend their lives assiduously filling the perceived gaps in their education tend to become much more accomplished than those who boast about their schooling. Jackson was largely self-taught and autodidact. He was steeped in Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible, steeped as in reading every day. He absorbed cadences, he paid attention to prose, he liked interesting words, especially strong verbs. Perhaps from Shakespeare, he learned the pleasing juxtaposition of Latinate words and Saxon words. Jackson prepared himself so well for eloquence that he rose to every challenge. At the age of 18 or 19, he heard a speech by a freshman state senator from Dutchess County, New York, a man who called himself Frank Roosevelt. Not Franklin yet. The two started a friendship. But the year was 1911, and Jackson was preparing himself to become a trial lawyer. By any measure, he succeeded in 20 years of practice in the courts there. One imagines stellar oratory whenever Jackson had the floor. Oratory fit for the occasion, perhaps the equal of Clarence Darrow or, in an earlier age, Daniel Webster. By 1934, 21 years into his law practice, he was national chair of the American Bar Association's House of Delegates. Roosevelt, having been elected president, brought Jackson to Washington. He met every administrative and rhetorical challenge there. In 1934, as counsel to the forerunner of the IRS. In 1936, as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Tax Division. The following year, in charge of the DOJ's Antitrust Division. And the year after that, as the Solicitor General of the United States. He was so good in that role that Justice Louis Brandeis said he should be Solicitor General for life. As an advocate, he salvaged at a precarious time the constitutionality of Roosevelt's New Deal. In January 1940, he was elevated to the Attorney General of the United States, a position he held for a year and a half. Then, in the summer of 1941, Roosevelt made him a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he was soon recognized as the preeminent writer on the court. Jackson is now thought of as the best writer ever to serve on the court. Today's justices idolize him. Justices Scalia and Ginsburg both considered Jackson their favorite judicial writer, as they individually told me in 2006 interviews. The other justices I spoke with also put him at the top. If you want an example of why, read his 1943 decision in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. It's the kind of writing that puts a lump in your throat, and the most enlightened legal scholars love it. What accounts for this literary accomplishment is many years of preparation. If success consists of preparation plus opportunity, and successful people prepare long before the opportunities arrive, Jackson proved himself ready for every opportunity that came his way. And the opportunities given to him grew in importance year by year until he had the greatest of them all, this one. It was more a responsibility than an opportunity, but in a way, every responsibility is an opportunity. He was to prosecute what is surely the greatest series of crimes the world had ever known. I think we could say the world has ever known. As he would later say about the prosecution, this is the first case I have ever tried when I had to first persuade others that a court should be established, help negotiate its establishment, and when that was done, not only prepare my case, but find myself a courtroom in which to try it. It was an extraordinary accomplishment, and it took every bit of skill that Jackson could muster. In fact, surely no other person of the time could have discharged the duty so capably. It involved a combination of skills, legal acuity, patience, thoroughness, the command of mountains of facts, the art of boiling down, and rhetorical prowess. It also involved hard labor. So let's look at certain turns of phrase that Jackson used. His secret, I think, was mixing plain talk with elevated speech. It wasn't constant figures of speech. That style soon sounds mannered and contrived. Instead, he used the down-to-earth language of his youth, mixed in with turns of phrase that he learned from poetry and literature. In his day, every highly literate person was expected to know two works, in particular, Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible, which Jackson valued primarily as literature. Today, by contrast, nobody is expected to know any text by heart. but that's a different talk. Now, I don't for a moment think that Justice Jackson knew the Greek names for the rhetorical figures of speech he used. They're useful to rhetoricians like me, but Jackson didn't have to know all the technical names, even though the basic ones like metaphor and simile, he certainly did. Jackson had simply imbibed these figures of speech. He knew them by heart because he'd encountered them hundreds of times in great literature. I'll bet he encountered them daily in his reading. And he was a practiced writer. He had learned the power of action verbs. Listen in this sentence to the verbs flushed, stung, stay, submit, and paid. And yet the fulcrum of the sentence is the be verb is. Here's the sentence. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. He capitalized power and reason because he was personifying them. Did you hear something else? An extraordinary combination of rhetorical figures, not just the personification of power and reason, but the metaphor of power paying tribute to reason. The metaphor is original with Jackson, and it's as good as any metaphor praised by Aristotle in his rhetoric. Speaking of which, he probably knew Aristotle's rhetoric. Let's analyze the structure of Jackson's speech and some instances of his rhetorical flair. But let me emphasize that although the ornaments are present in every paragraph of the speech, the most impressive aspect of the closing argument is the lawyering. Jackson synthesizes 17 months worth of testimony and documentary evidence into the compass of a 2.5-hour speech. He methodically lays out the evidence as only a first-rate lawyer could do. But unlike other first-rate lawyers, Jackson had the stylistic flair of Cicero or Shakespeare or Jefferson or Twain or Churchill. The moment Jackson expressed a thought, he had you paying attention. To illustrate this almost ineffable quality, let's contrast 2 passages, one by Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, and one by Sir Hartley Shawcross, the chief British prosecutor. These 2 quotations appear alongside each other in Francis McNamara's collection of legal quotations. They come from the opening arguments at Nuremberg. First, Shawcross. He said, quote, "The warrant of no man excuseth the doing of an illegal act. Political loyalty, military obedience are excellent things, but they neither require nor do they justify the commission of patently wicked acts. There comes a point where a man must refuse to answer to his leader if he is also to answer to his conscience." It's not bad, but it's not very memorable. Now, Jackson, he said, quote, "We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our task that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice." Shawcross's passage is 56 words. Jackson's is 67. Shawcross begins with an obscure quotation that isn't immediately understandable, especially the phrase, "the warrant of no man." There is a lapse in grammatical parallelism. They neither require nor do they justify. And the one rhetorical flourish, the repetition of answer in answer to his leader if he is also to answer to his conscience, is humdrum. Jackson, by contrast, uses at least 4 figures of speech in his first 41 words. Bear with me, I'm going to use some technical terms. It's the only way to explain. To anyone who says I'm doing the equivalent of explaining a joke, which makes it unfunny, I'll say, fair enough. Just enjoy the joke, they might say. Or here, just admire the eloquence. But to a technician, that's insufficient. Certainly if you hope to understand what's going on and not have things lost on you. Much of the rest of my talk is going to be to this kind of audience, the kind of person on whom nothing is lost, or very little anyway. Let me repeat Jackson's passage. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our task that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice. Jackson uses a figure of speech here called simplicy, S-Y-M-P-L-O-C-E, simplicy. He might not have known the name, but he certainly knew the figure of speech by heart, both from his reading and from his own practice. It involves repeating words at the start of consecutive clauses, with other words repeated at the end of them, and a few words changed in the middle. Listen to the words record on which and judge, and hear the slight differences. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. Then there's the antithesis of today and tomorrow. The next sentence has a heightened classical metaphor straight from Shakespeare's Macbeth. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. But he changes it slightly. He didn't have Shakespeare with him, by the way, in Nuremberg. He was doing this from memory. He changes it slightly. Macbeth conjured the image of even-handed justice that commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. Jackson instead makes this, to pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. To summarily kill these defendants, Jackson is saying, is to kill civilization as well. And he personifies society, society's lips that take from the poisoned chalice. So, simplicity, antithesis, metaphor, personification, all in 41 words, plus literary allusion. And he knew very well what he was doing. He was an artist with words. It shows in every paragraph of the closing argument. Now, the structure of the summation. It begins, introduction. Then there are 7 major divisions. Part 1, crimes of the Nazi regime. A, the seizure of power and subjugation of Germany to a police state. B, the preparation and waging of wars of aggression. C, warfare in disregard of international law. D, enslavement and plunder of populations in occupied territories. E, persecution and extermination of Jews and Christians. Part 2, the common plan or conspiracy. Part 3, every defendant played a part. Part 4, the war was deliberately planned. Part 5, the common defenses against the common charge, against the charge of common responsibility. Part 6, Schacht's defenses typically inconsistent. Part 7, defendants attempt to blame their dead and missing co-conspirators. And then his conclusion. He makes his positive case in the first 4 sections: the crimes, the conspiracy, the involvement of every defendant, and the deliberate planning. Then he debunks the counter-arguments in 3 sections: the common defenses against common responsibility, the inconsistent positions, and the pervasive attempts to blame only dead people. As for the crimes, there are 5. The subjugation of Germany. First, the subjugation of Germany. Second, the preparation for wars of aggression. Third, the violations of international law. Fourth, the enslavement and plunder of populations. And 5, the extermination of Jews. You might wonder why genocide comes last, in 5th place. 2 reasons. First, he was following Aristotle's advice that in oral delivery, you end with your strongest point. He built to the climax. If he had begun with genocide, the rest would have seemed almost like a letdown. Second, he was following the chronology. He was telling a story. The subjugation and the wars led to the genocide or enabled the genocide. Architecturally, the speech is flawless. The whole speech is essentially a masterclass in rhetoric. Rhetoric in Aristotle's sense, proper words in proper places, memorable phrasings. Let's look at 8 techniques that Jackson used with specific illustrations. Alliteration first. Repeated sounds of words, especially initial consonants. These examples all come from the closing argument. Mad and melancholy record. Calm and critical judgment. Concentration camps were the first and worst weapon of oppression. Hitler boldly and baldly stated. Bloody brotherhood. Wind and wisdom. Weak and willing tool. The fanatical Frank. The venomous vulgarian. The German juggernaut. For blackmail, not for battle. Contention crumbles in the face of the facts. Hitler was a mad messiah. Second, literary allusion. The indirect evocation of classic literature. Whether in his judicial opinions or in his other writings, Jackson had a light touch with literary allusion. He would simply quote without heavy-handedly giving the source and making some of his audience feel ignorant. Instead, he quoted literature so that even if you were unfamiliar with the passage from King Lear or Richard III or Hamlet or Macbeth, you understood exactly what he was saying. Nothing would be lost on the unlettered reader or listener. But for the literary, his allusions were intellectually pleasing. This one comes from Richard III. Here's what he said. The defendants stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the queen replied, then say they were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say there has been no war, there are no slain, there has been no crime. Those were his closing words. Now this example, it's reminiscent of the Gettysburg Address. This is toward the beginning of the Summation. These 200 years in the 20th century will be recorded in the Book of Years as one of the most bloody in all annals. You may ask, why most bloody? Why not bloodiest? The answer, once again, is surely Shakespeare. Shakespeare used the word bloodiest only once in one of his worst plays, King John. He used most bloody 5 times. In Julius Caesar, for example, oh, most bloody sight. And in Macbeth, which Jackson seems to have known by heart, this most bloody piece of work. The speech is full of these reminiscent phrasings, even though you hear the echo of Gettysburg in that sentence, Macbeth is there as well. One more time, these 200 years in the 20th century will be recorded in the Book of Years as one of the most bloody in all annals. There are dozens of other allusions. It would take a team of literature professors to unearth them all, just the ones in the summation. Number 3, anaphora. Anaphora is starting consecutive clauses or phrases with the same words. It's standard in high oratorical style. It's sometimes rather lamely attempted by modern politicians. One moment of greatness for anaphora came with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, in which he began 8 consecutive sentences with I have a dream. Some authorities restrict its application to clauses, but others include phrases, which is how Jackson usually employed it. In this example, listen for the word without. The refrain is heard time and again. These men were without authority, without knowledge, without influence, without importance. Here's an example with such. No half-century ever witnessed slaughter on such a scale, such cruelties and inhumanities, such wholesale deportations of people into slavery, such annihilations of minorities. Number 4, climax. Climax to a rhetorician is building to the most important word at the end. This is a staple in Jackson's rhetorical toolbox. It's a great secret of his phrasing, the powerful word at the end of a sentence. I'll give one of countless examples. Quote, Kaltenbrunner, the Grand Inquisitor, took up the bloody mantle of Heydrich to stifle opposition and terrorize compliance and buttress the power of National Socialism on a foundation of guiltless corpses. Number 5, isocolon. The use of consecutive phrases or clauses, similar in length and parallel in grammatical structure. The speech is teeming with isocolons. 2 instances in this passage. Quote, civilians were arrested without charges, committed without counsel, executed without hearing. Villages were destroyed, the male inhabitants shot or sent to concentration camps, the women sent to forced labor, and the children scattered abroad. In this instance, listen for embrace, incite, and exploit. Although the Nazi Party neither invented nor monopolized anti-Semitism, its leaders from the very beginning embraced it, incited it, and exploited it. Number 6, metaphor. An implied comparison by figuratively using a word or phrase in an analogous sense. Listen here for the sleep metaphor. While a credulous world slumbered, snugly blanketed with perfidious assurances of peaceful intentions, the Nazis prepared not merely as before for a war, but for the war. Listen here for the pie metaphor. The large and varied role of Goering was half militarist and half gangster. He stuck a pudgy finger in every pie. Number 7, simile. Simile, as you know, usually involves a comparison with like or as. In this example from Jackson's closing argument, it's not like or as, but in the position of. Listen for in the position of. Quote, the defendants may have become slaves of a dictator, but he was their dictator. To make him such was, as Goering has testified, the object of the Nazi movement from the beginning. Every Nazi took this oath. I pledge eternal allegiance to Adolf Hitler. I pledge unconditional obedience to him and the Führers appointed by him. Moreover, they forced everybody else in their power to take that oath. It was illegal under German law, which made it criminal to become a member of an organization in which obedience to unknown superiors or unconditional obedience to known superiors is pledged. These men destroyed free government in Germany and now plead to be excused from responsibility because they became slaves. They are in the position of the fictional boy who murdered his father and mother and then pleaded for leniency because he was an orphan. Number 8, synecdoche. Synecdoche is referring to a part of something to denote the whole of it. It is spelled, this of course is being broadcast from Jamestown, New York. This is not Schenectady, New York. It is synecdoche, Synecdoche, referring to a part to denote the whole. Note in this passage the words denoting parts of the human body: head, eyes, ears, legs, and hands. Jackson is referring to people, but to do so, he speaks of the head, legs, hands, and so on. Quote, "I admit that Hitler was the chief villain, but for the defendants to put all blame on him is neither manly nor true. We know that even the head of a state has the same limits to his senses and to the hours of his day as do lesser men. He must rely on others to be his eyes and ears, as to most that goes on in a great empire. Other legs must run his errands. Other hands must execute his plans." So that's 8. Forget about figures of speech for a moment. You have to admire Jackson's plain talk in exposing deceptive language. Here's what he says toward the close of his summation. Quote, "The fact is that the Nazi habit of economizing and the use," let me start again. "The fact is that the Nazi habit of economizing and the use of truth pulls the foundations out from under their own defenses. Lying has always been a highly approved Nazi technique. They all speak with a Nazi double talk with which to deceive the unwary. In the Nazi dictionary of sardonic euphemisms, final solution of the Jewish problem was a phrase which meant extermination. Special treatment of prisoners of war meant killing. Protective custody meant concentration camp. Duty labor meant slave labor. And an order to take a firm attitude or take positive measures meant to act with unrestrained savagery. Before we accept their word at what seems to be its fact, we must always look for hidden meanings." Jackson then goes through many instances of lies, followed by this, quote, "When it was necessary to remove Schuschnigg after the Anschluss, Ribbentrop would have had us believe that the Austrian chancellor was resting at a villa. It was left to cross-examination to reveal that the villa was Buchenwald concentration camp. The record is full of other examples of dissimulations and evasions. Even Schacht showed that he too had adopted the Nazi attitude that truth is any story which succeeds." The Nazi attitude that truth is any story which succeeds. The Nazi attitude that truth is any story which succeeds. Now for 2 little backstories that you've never heard. One is about Colonel Meade F. Griffin and the other Texas lawyers who prosecuted German war crimes. The other is about Justice Jackson's old friend, Oscar Stossel. In German, it's Stossel, but I think after he moved to America, it was Stossel. The other is, Stossel's family perished in the Nazi concentration camps. Of all Jackson's acquaintances who might have been personally afflicted by the Nazis and the Holocaust, Oscar Stossel surely spent more time with the justice in chambers than anyone else. You see, in the 1930s, Oscar Stossel, here he is. Oscar Stossel. In the 1930s, Oscar Stossel was the most talented etcher as a portraitist in all of Europe. But he and his family were persecuted by the Nazis. They were a Jewish family in Austria. The atrocities that Oscar, living in Vienna, experienced in the Anschluss and on Kristallnacht are unimaginable. The Nazis confiscated his property, but he managed to escape to Paris and then to America. He arrived as a refugee the first week of March 1939. Just 10 months later, he spent an hour. He was a refugee. 10 months after arriving on these shores, he spent an hour in the Oval Office doing a portrait of President Franklin Roosevelt. It would come to be Eleanor Roosevelt's favorite. By the way, I have that portrait right back over here. Somebody asked me, I'll show you on the Q&A. It would come to be Eleanor's favorite. Imagine a refugee is given an hour-long audience with the president. It's unthinkable today. Then he made portraits of the entire US Supreme Court. Within the first month of Jackson's first term on the court, on October 27th, 1941, Jackson had Stossel in chambers for at least an hour. Stossel made a superbly etched portrait of Jackson. You see it right here over my shoulder. This is Stossel's portrait of Jackson, autographed, by the way, by Jackson. By 1942, Jackson was calling Stossel an old friend. Who knows what they talked about? Only Oscar and his brother Ludwig, the actor, got out. Oscar lived in Carnegie Hall for 20 years. Ludwig spent the rest of his life in Hollywood. He acted in Casablanca. Most of the rest of the family died in concentration camps, and Oscar would learn only in the middle of the Nuremberg trials that had happened. I would like to think that Jackson thought of Oscar from time to time while doing his work in Nuremberg. Now, for the other backstory, the Texas contingent. 3 Texans especially come to mind. Colonel Meade F. Griffin, my grandfather, was chief of the prosecution section of the U.S. Army in Wiesbaden. He would later become, for 20 years, a justice on the Supreme Court of Texas. You see his portrait behind me here. He died when I was 15, but I heard him recount events of his wartime years. His law school classmate, Robert G. Story, served as executive trial counsel to Jackson and played a critical role in Nuremberg. Story would go on to become dean of Southern Methodist University School of Law here in Dallas and would establish the Southwestern Legal Foundation, now known as the Center for American and International Law. Leon Jaworski, the third of the trio, the famous Houston lawyer, spoke fluent German and was crucial as a prosecutor. In 1961, he wrote a book about his work in the Wiesbaden prosecutions called After 15 Years. Justice Jackson alluded to their activities, the Wiesbaden activities, toward the end of his summation. Here's what he said, quote, "All over Germany today, in every zone of occupation, little men who carried out these criminal policies under orders are being convicted and punished. It would present a vast and unforgivable caricature of justice if the men who planned these policies and directed those little men should escape all penalty." There were 21 or 22 defendants in Nuremberg. In his closing, Jackson says 20 odd. My grandfather was in charge of 3,600 prosecutions in Wiesbaden. I don't think he ever met Jackson, who spent little time in Wiesbaden, but their activities were very much aligned. In private correspondence, Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone criticized the Nuremberg prosecution, calling it a high-grade lynching party. There were many such critics, but what did they want? Summary executions? No semblance of a hearing, no record made with the opportunity to hear what the Nazi kingpins had to say? Would that be consistent with establishing an international rule of law? Stone wrote that it would not disturb him greatly if the Allied victors, quote, openly and frankly punished the German leaders for being a bad lot, end quote. He said, quote, it disturbs me some to have it dressed up in the habiliments of the common law and the constitutional safeguards to those charged with crime, end quote. Justice Jackson's response reveals how he viewed the Nuremberg trials. Quote, this is Jackson. When did it become a crime to be one of a bad lot? What was the specific badness for which they should be openly and frankly punished? And how did we know what individuals were included in the bad lot? If it would have been right to punish the vanquished out of hand for being a bad lot, what made it wrong to have first a safeguarded hearing to make sure who was bad and how bad and of what the badness consisted? My grandfather's prosecutions were a microcosm of what Jackson was dealing with. And most people have no inkling of the other prosecutions that were going on within military tribunals. The colonels in charge of those Wiesbaden prosecutions were wrestling with many of the same issues as their higher profile counterparts in Nuremberg. I'm going to read to you an account that corroborates what Jackson said. These were no show trials. They were an attempt to apply real law. Jackson had been a small town lawyer in southwestern New York. My grandfather had practiced law for 25 years in the sparsely populated panhandle of Texas, a rich background both in prosecuting and defending people accused of crimes. In Plainview, Texas, in the 1920s and 1930s, one of the chief recreations was to go to the courthouse and watch Meade Griffin try a case. In any event, here is his account of a major debate that took place in Wiesbaden about the same time as Jackson was encountering resistance in Nuremberg. This comes from a recording that Judge Griffin made 2 years before he died in 1974. It hasn't been published, and it's now making, this part of it anyway, its world premiere. I'll publish it as a whole book someday. These are the words Judge Griffin spoke into his recording device in his study nearly 50 years ago. Quote, we had about 3,600 war crimes, and the duty of my section was to examine each one of these records and see whether we thought that each one could be prosecuted to conviction before a military commission of 5 to 7 members. Every war crime was punishable by death. Out of this 3,600, we had about 1,200 murders. All sorts of methods, shooting them, cutting their throats, poisoning them, killing in every way you could think of. I said to the officers of my section, now we're not going to prosecute a fellow for slapping an American soldier or kicking him in the rear. We'll prosecute the murders. We're writing for history and conducting ourselves for history. Sometime after the emotions of the war have all died, and most of the people have died and it's gotten far enough in the background to be history, other folks will be looking over what we have done. We should have nothing to fear in the eyes of those who look into our actions 100 or 150 years from now. We should know that what we're doing is right and correct. My job, still quoting, my job, in addition to drafting the rules and regulations for prosecuting, after I'd been examining these records, was to standardize the charges. This was the first time in international law that this had been done. What we were doing was plowing a new road, and our rules and regulations went to American armies all over the world for their use in drawing their own rules and regulations. My officers who worked under me would make an examination record, and then they'd write me a little summary with their recommendations, and then they'd draw the charges. A charge came up to me, we'll say charging Hans Schmidt with killing John Smith. It didn't allege the means or methods which he used. So I took it up to Colonel Claude B. Micklethwait, the head of the War Crimes Division. I said, Colonel, that's not fair. I know it's not fair. We must charge this man with the means and methods which he used. And he said, no, he knows how he killed him. I said, You've judged his guilt before you even tried him, if you assume that he knows how he killed him. If I were representing him, I'd come in and say I wanted a continuance. I'm not ready for trial. I didn't know what witnesses to bring. I didn't know whether you were going to try to prove whether my client burned this man at the stake, or cut his throat, or hung him up by his toes till he choked to death, or hanged him, or stabbed him, or shot him, or poisoned him, or cut his guts out and left him to die, or what you were going to try to prove. I'm not prepared for trial. You're going to have to give me a continuance and let me know what you're going to charge. We had a whole afternoon session on that with Colonel Micklethwait and others. They finally said, no, Colonel Griffin, he knows how he knows how he killed him. Military justice is not like civil justice. I said, I know, but history is going to be looking at this. They don't give a damn about Meade Griffin or Colonel Micklethwait or anybody else. But 150 years from now, the first time they can dispassionately look at it, they will blame my government, the United States of America. I know this is not right. They overruled me. I didn't sleep much that night because I knew it wasn't right. The next morning, I went down there and said, now, Colonel Micklethwait, I'm not just being hard-headed, and I'm not just trying to carry my point, but I didn't sleep much last night. And the reason is I know this is wrong, and history will misjudge us. We ought to put in there the means and methods of committing the crime. He said, well, Colonel Griffin, that's a command decision. I said, Colonel Micklethwait, I'm a good soldier. If it's a command decision, you'll never hear another word out of me. So I let those charges go. They went down to General Patton at the Third Army, and it took about a week to get from Wiesbaden to Munich in those days. The roads were all shot up and the communications were distorted. There were no business buses or trains. About 2 days after the charges got down there, Patton's Judge Advocate General called up and talked to Colonel Micklethwait, saying, Mick, the general wants to know if we've got to try this case on the charge as it's set down here, or whether we have any authority to change that charge. Colonel Micklethwait said, what's the matter? Well, General Patton says that the charge ought to contain a statement of the means and methods used by the accused in killing the deceased. Mick said, oh, hell, that's what Colonel Griffin's been arguing around here for a couple of weeks. Go ahead and change it to suit General Patton. So then Colonel Micklethwait called me up and told me about the conversation. He said, go ahead and fix these charges up so that they'll show the means and methods used whereby the accused killed the deceased. I said, very well, Colonel, I will. End quote. This firsthand account, I think, corroborates Justice Jackson's views that the war crime tribunals were dispensing real justice, not victor's vengeance. Some critics still call Nuremberg a 20th century show trial. A show trial? Is that what we think of it? Do we understand? Do people even want to understand? Do modern critics try to place themselves in the shoes of the responsible officers? At all levels, the prosecutors of German war crimes were acutely aware of the morality, legality, and propriety of their actions. Remember what Jackson said, we must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. My grandfather might not have known Justice Jackson, but it gives me great satisfaction to think of his contributions as an ally in Jackson's noble endeavor, and to think that they would have liked each other. And it would please them both, I think, that we sit here 75 years later, as people will do 100 and 150 years later, to commemorate honorable deeds. Let's hope they'll have a yearning to understand. Jackson said it best. Again, from the closing, quote, we have moved to redress the blight on the record of our era. The defendants complain that our pace is too fast. In drawing the charter of this tribunal, we thought we were recording an accomplished advance in international law. But they say we have outrun our times, that we have anticipated an advance that should be, but has not yet been made. The Agreement of London, whether it originates or merely records, at all events marks a transition in international law, which roughly corresponds to that in the evolution of local law when men ceased to punish local crime by hue and cry, and began to let reason and inquiry govern punishment. The Society of Nations has emerged from the primitive hue and cry, the law of catch and kill. It seeks to apply sanctions to enforce international law, but to guide their application by evidence, law, and reason instead of outcry. Of one thing we may be sure: the future will never have to ask with misgiving, what could the Nazis have said in their favor? History will know that whatever could be said, they were allowed to say. They have been given the kind of trial which they, in the days of their pomp and power, never gave to any man. End quote. Let us remember, 75 years ago today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan, for sharing your reflections with us today. As Bryan alluded to, we do have some time for questions. So if anyone in our audience has a question for Bryan, or me, I guess, but please let me know. Bryan, I think one of the things I am most struck by is hearing his words out loud. I am so thrilled that we have both the audio recording of it as well as the written, because I think his delivery also provides such insight into the gravity and the importance of this speech.
He had a very stately delivery. I couldn't do it justice, of course, but I did my best.
You did excellent. We do actually have a request to show the FDR portrait.
By Oscar Stossel.
Yes.
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Some people say it was an idealized portrait. I think it's a rather good portrait. Idealized, maybe that's why Eleanor Roosevelt liked it so much. This is it. I'm trying to do it so that it doesn't have a glare on it.
You're doing great. Yep.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
And you know, the U.S. Supreme Court has many of the Stossel etchings, but they do not have the Jackson. I think the Jackson portrait is the one Stossel that they don't have. I had an extra copy of the FDR portrait, so I gave it to the U.S. Supreme Court a couple of years ago.
That's wonderful. So we did get a question from John wondering if Justice Scalia ever expressed his views on the Nuremberg trials. Are you familiar with anything like that?
I think he was, he had extreme admiration for Justice Jackson. I think he was a little concerned about what he had heard and looked at about the possibility that some of the crimes charged were essentially ex post facto and were not in writing before the war. So I think he was troubled by it some, but I think he thought he had not really formulated a final opinion about it.
And I, to that point, and certainly my opinion is completely as a layperson, what struck me also about the closing was how much it was rooted in history, historical references, and also, as you mentioned, references to literature to try and, I think, give it that grounding to perhaps combat some of those criticisms about these crimes being new. And so that's something in my mind as well.
Well, the crimes that were charged, really, I mean, it gets into a kind of natural law view. It's just contrary to any person's common sense of justice. And so it's, all the crimes certainly were that, even if they had not been formally ratified as part of international law.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to mention there was a thank you from Tom Loftus, who is Justice Jackson's grandson. So from one grandson to another, he thanked you for a wonderful presentation.
I hope I'll be able to meet Tom Loftus someday. That's great to hear. That's great to hear.
Bryan, this might be a little bit outside your purview, but I'll ask this question in case you have any insight into it. So we got a question from John that given that Jackson was off the Supreme Court, took his leave of absence for about 15 months, do we have any sense of what effect that absence had on his reputation as a justice and as a jurist? I don't know if there's anything you've come across in your readings or your other studies that might speak to that.
Well, he was very much in line to be the next Chief Justice. Roosevelt certainly thought so, and Truman liked him a lot, and I think Truman had him in mind as the next chief. I think it was April of 40. Oh, well, it was it was in the spring that Stone died, essentially on the bench when he was over, when Jackson was over in Europe trying the war crimes. And I think partly because he was gone, but also because he wasn't there to defend himself. He had two justices who despised him, Hugo Black and William O. Douglas. And I understand from the great scholar John Q. Barrett that essentially Black and Douglas let it be known that they would resign from the court if Jackson were elevated to the chiefship. So I think it was partly his absence he was busy doing this prosecutorial work and he couldn't defend himself. He wasn't there. So, there's this old adage that the absent are always to blame because whoever's absent, because they're not there to defend themselves.
I have a question from William, and the question is, do you know the particulars of Jackson's preparation of his remarks? How much time did he spend on it? From also conversations I've had with Professor Barrett, I understand he was a writer and rewriter and redrafter, but he did all of that very quickly. So just seeing if you also have any insight into his preparation.
I think he probably was a very quick writer once he knew what he wanted to say. In fact, there's a lot of historical evidence that the best writing is done very swiftly. I do think he was rewriting drafts that were given to him by different people involved in the prosecution, and some of his executive assistants, like Robert Story, chief counsel to Jackson in the trials. So I think he was revising work, but I don't know a great deal about the composition.
A question from Marion. Given the extraordinary length of Jackson's closing statement, do you think it would have been improved by editing it? Or for the times and for the gravity of this case, was the length appropriate?
I think it was appropriate. And yeah, that's my view of it. There was just a lot of evidence to marshal and to distill, and he did it very painstakingly. I mean, one might expect that. Why didn't he just do it in broad brush strokes? Well, he had to get into a great many particulars, and so I think it was probably, as I say, I think it's just about right. It's structurally flawless. The one stylistic habit that I don't love that Jackson had is that he constantly used the word which as a restrictive relative pronoun. I wish he'd used that. Or I want to change a lot of whiches to that's when I'm reading his speeches and even his judicial opinions, but I really can't fault him. I mean, he was following a British practice in that way.
Question from Ryan. So Robert H. Jackson made it a point to make sure the court knew the defendants were unanimously pointing fingers at people who were either dead or missing from the trial. So how did Jackson, in your opinion, handle the task of making sure history knew that Hitler was the chief architect, but still make the case that the defendants were guilty of their own unique crimes?
Well, he conceded that Hitler was, there was a nice little concession that he made, that Hitler was the chief criminal and was the architect of it all, but that they were, all these other subordinates were enablers, and actually they they exacerbated Hitler's horrible nature. They allowed it to happen, but they made it even more pernicious. So I think he did that very effectively, with a kind of confession that yes, Hitler was the worst, but again, bringing it back to the acts of these particular defendants. It was very effective.
Maybe a final question from Paul, since we're a little bit beyond the 4 p.m. mark Eastern. Was Jackson criticized for being informal and using verbs like loot and goose step in his closing? You know, great, they're very evocative, but perhaps not customarily sober or that high level of rhetoric. And that question is from Paul, in case I did not say that to start.
I'm sure he was criticized. He was also criticized for his opinions on the court. Justice Scalia thought it was wonderful that I was able to point out to him that in the American Bar Association Journal, Jackson was criticized as being uncivil to his colleagues in his dissenting opinions, as being so hard-hitting. And yet that was nothing compared to what would come to be in the decades later. But Justice Scalia liked that a lot. You know, there are always lawyers who argue against any kind of informality, whether it's contractions or a little bit of colloquiality mixed with that high level of formality. And Jackson was mixing both styles very effectively. If he had gotten rid of those colloquial verbs like goose step, he was using goose step as a verb and sort of personifying all Nazis goose stepping through Europe, he would have been much less powerful. So one of the things lawyers on the whole need to learn about writing is to allow a little informality in, and you know, open a window and let some fresh air in, but not be constantly stuffy. Stuffiness is the enemy of good writing in law, and it is a perennial problem. But Justice Jackson did not have that problem.
Well, and I appreciate you also highlighting him as one of the most admired writers of the court. It is certainly something we at the Jackson Center try to showcase regularly by using his quotes and using parts of his opinions or speeches as publicly as we can. There are a lot of questions we are not going to have time to get to live, but we will do our best to send you answers to those questions. I also did get a few questions as to whether or not the recording of this will be available after this, and absolutely it will. We will send out a link to everyone who registered. It will be on the Jackson Center's YouTube channel, likely tomorrow. And so we'll send out a notice to everyone who has registered for this, and also publish that more widely as well. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar on Jackson's prose. And Bryan, thank you so much for helping us to understand the language and its usage and place in history and the collective consciousness, and why it still resonates with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Remember to join the Jackson Center on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of every month, when we host virtual conversations about the work left to do, which is our 2021 programming theme. And we showcase how Jacksonian thinking and work lives in the world today. And you can find out more information about these programs and all of our programs on the Jackson Center website at roberthjackson.org. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.